Hi, and welcome back to PDA Dads UK. In this episode, I'll be talking to Marie Gentles, who was the main focus of the TV show Don't Exclude Me. And we're going to be talking to Marie about a number of the issues that came out from that show. So as I say, welcome back to PDA Dads UK. Before we do go on, please go down, hit like, hit subscribe, ring the bell so that you know when new content's coming up. As I said before, we are speaking this week with Marie Gentles. Now, Marie was the focus of the show Don't Exclude Me. And you'll recall I did a review and reaction video to the first episode of that show. And I reached out to Marie to say, I'd really like to discuss these things with you. And to my surprise, she was actually quite keen to talk, and she was aware of a number of the issues that we had. Because I am neurotypical myself, I didn't want to be speaking for autistic people and their concerns. So what I did was I invited Sarah Boon on as well. Now, Sarah, you may recall from my video on Spectrum 10K, she is a very passionate and articulate advocate for autism, who is also herself autistic. And the best thing we could have done was to invite her on so that there is the autistic voice heard as well. Now, if you joined us from the Grumpy Dads, this is basically the full version of that video. So without further ado, this is the interview I had with Marie. I'd like to welcome our guests. First of all, thank you so much for joining us, Marie Gentles.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. And Sarah Boon. So for those who don't know, Sarah is an autistic, ADHD and dyslexic advocate for autism, and spends a lot of time supporting families and working alongside autistic people. Do you want to give us a brief rundown of what you do, Sarah?
Yeah, so I work with family support. So that's probably what I spend about half my time doing. So that's kind of families going through the diagnosis process and at the very early stages, understanding, what does this mean, how we can support our child. And I guess that mind shift as well, because it can be quite suddenly, your child's got this diagnosis. And I think unless you kind of know what it's about, there can be a lot of uncertainty. So I spend half my time doing that, and then probably spend the other half my time doing various things, but it's mainly kind of working alongside autistic adults, help facilitate support groups, those sort of things. So that's kind of generally about me and the work I do at the moment.
Fantastic. Now, those of you who've been watching will recognise Marie, and Marie was on the TV show Don't Exclude Me on BBC Two. And amongst the neurodiverse community, there was a lot of concern over the show and the way it was presented, I guess, and a lot of people sort of jumping on with a lot of questions that weren't necessarily getting answered. Thankfully, Marie's been really open to talking with us. She really does want to set the record straight. Do you want to give us a brief rundown of exactly what it is you do, Marie?
Yeah, of course. So currently I work with my business partner, Katie Lamarb at Magic Behaviour Management, and we're an educational consultancy, and we also train around behaviour. We work with so many different groups of professionals. We work with police, social care, schools, parents, families, just basically any adults who work with children, vulnerable children and young people. But prior to that, a couple of years ago, I was a head at an outstanding pupil referral unit, which was amazing, worked there for 10 years. And prior to that, I worked in the mainstream setting, worked in the mainstream for about 7-8 years. So really kind of diverse and interesting experiences that I've loved every minute of. And then on top of that, something I don't talk about a lot actually, but I think now's a really good time to, is my family. I have quite a diverse family. We have a lot of adopted and foster children in our family, and we also have a lot of children and young people and young adults in our family with different needs as well.
Thank you so much. So we decided we want to do this based on the idea that it's so much better to be able to set the record straight and make sure we're on the right track. And, there's obviously some issues that came up as a result of the show that I was concerned with, other people were concerned with, but it's also something that, unless there's a voice given, you don't get a chance to respond to that and actually I set the record straight or whatever. So that's kind of what we're here to do. And to also, I guess, discuss the issues that came out of that. So, I mean, how did you get involved with the show in the first place, Marie?
So when I worked at the pupil referral unit, I started there as a deputy head. And when the head teacher left, she hadn't planned to, but she left, I had no intention whatsoever of ever being a head teacher, but it just made sense to go for the position because I just knew the place inside out. And so prior to me going to interview, I was unaware that the executive head had been in discussions with the Victoria Derbyshire programme around running like a live morning, if you like, with inside the pupil referral unit, because that's never been done before for younger children.
Yeah.
So when I got the position, they also said, and by the way, this is what we're going to do. So I just inherited it. It's really interesting because I'm very much like, oh, don't like the limelight, don't put me there. But if it means that it's about having a voice and about pulling communities together, then I'll do it because I'm really passionate about what I do. So I inherited that and we did it, and it was very, very successful. The children who featured on it have gone on and are, doing amazing things. And I saw the positive impact for those young people. So from there, kind of almost unbeknown to me, the BBC were then in talks for about 18 months. I didn't have any contact with them about what they could potentially do. And then someone got back in contact with me and said, look, we have this idea. What do you think about this? I was quite apprehensive, but said, OK, let's see what this looks like. And they basically said it will just be following you around doing the job that you do. So I thought, OK, I can do that. If it means that more people, more families, more parents, etc., we can start talking more about certain topics, then I'll do it. So that's how it came about.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I watched the show with considerable interest. So those who are watching, if you've watched my other stuff, you'll know my daughter is autistic. She has pathological demand avoidance profile with sensory processing disorder and a whole list of other 3-letter acronyms that follow her name. And I did watch it. I've got to say it was both. It was a hard watch for me, I would say. Not in the sense that, kind of watching Schindler's List is a hard watch, but in the sense that this just really hit home. These kids shared a lot that I see with my daughter.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're fortunate enough that she's in a special educational needs school because mainstream was not working for her at all. And I was interested to see the approach that was, because this is a mainstream school that you went into with this. I was interested to see, and it really, it hit home with a lot of the behaviours, but also understanding what goes behind those behaviours. Would you want to add anything to this, Sarah?
Yeah, because I think the key thing, obviously when I saw the programme come up, I was like, I'm definitely interested in this. But I think a lot of the time, I think something I notice is a lot of people focus on the outside behaviour, and it's actually I think something I've learned over the years, it's so much more important to understand what's going on behind the scenes, what's led to that, what's contributed to that. And I think with the show, obviously you're just getting a glimpse of the outside. So although I was watching it and I had my views, there was that certain extent of actually I'm not seeing the whole picture of someone, of what's going on, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That makes full sense. And I think what's interesting about that is that when we talked about doing the show, we talked about how do we reach as many audiences as possible. So how do we reach the teachers who do not understand that behaviour is a language of communication, do not understand that behaviour is a communication of an unmet need, but also the parents, how do we reach them? So we had to think of a starting point. So it's really interesting because the feedback from the neurodiverse community, I will not sit here and kind of try and defend myself and argue my point. I am so open to anything and everything that will support children and young people. I really am. However, I think what I will say is that it's so difficult because obviously we spent hundreds of hours filming, hundreds and hundreds, but then I didn't have any say about what was going to be edited afterwards, which is part of TV. I know that. Yeah. But what was so interesting is that the behaviour is what school staff see. So they see the behaviour. So when I was talking to the school staff, what I was communicating to them is you cannot react to the behaviour. We need to understand what is the behaviour communicating, what is the unmet need of these young people that we need to address in order to be able to then meet their needs. But that had to be the starting point because some school staff and some parents sitting at home hadn't even reached that point yet. And I say a phrase, no blame, no shame. That means no blaming any adult and no shaming anybody. It's really important, I think. And so no blame, no shame, whatever our perceptions or our thoughts are around things prior, it's okay. But actually what's important is that if that is a starting point, then if the first point of our thinking can be, okay, this isn't just a behavior, this is a communication of an unmet need. If we can just change our perceptions around that, then that could just be a first stage, a first step. So to me, that's what was really important about the show, because I knew we wouldn't be able to get into the details of everything within 2 hours, but that's what I really wanted to try and communicate as far as I could.
It's interesting, and I kind of saw that, I've got to say, as I think when I did my review in response to it initially, you could see that. That was actually one of the things I found joy in, was one of the young lads, Jack, who was, you picked up that there was a quite a deep relationship between him and his teacher there, but that it was being expressed in maybe the wrong way. And you sort of brought them together and you gave them that sort of 10 minutes at the end of the day. And seeing the difference when he got that engagement was a beautiful thing to see, and the smile on his face. He really got into that. I definitely saw that reflected. If you were able to make if this was you making the show, what sort of stuff would you have put in there that maybe got edited out because of, obviously it goes through the BBC and they've done their stuff with it? What would you like to have seen included that wasn't?
So what I would have liked to see included, and what I would have done personally, is what we do on our training. So we would talk about, we start by talking about perception. So understanding that wherever you're standing from, every single person's going to have a different perception around what you see. So just the surface level stuff. So that's what we start with. So that's what I would have really wanted to start with, because everybody watching, sitting wherever they were sitting, watching the TV, everyone's coming from a different place. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is about understanding the elements of containment. So when I said these strategies will work for all, what I meant was these strategies, and had said was, every single person, regardless of their needs, has a right to feel emotionally safe and contained. Doesn't matter what your needs are, we all have that right. So the strategies that I use are containment strategies. So there's 7 elements, and that they're all the elements equally balanced and implemented are the way I have worked over the years with external professionals as well, with other professionals as well, in order to support and meet the needs of vulnerable young people. And no one piece of those strategies by themselves will work alone. So lots of people, understandably so, talked about consequences as an example. I 100% agree. If you go consequence heavy with any child or any person, it's not going to work. Of course it's not. But actually that wasn't the message. The message was, if you understand that consequences, if they're implemented and fairly balanced, and you understand the young person's needs, etc., fairly implemented alongside all of the other 7 containment elements. So that's expectations, attachments, routines, boundaries, all of the language, all of those things then equate to emotional safety, certainty from a routine, for example, emotional support, emotional security. That's what it provides. If you provide all of them in equal weight and balance, dependent upon an individual's need, whilst working multi-agency. That's what I would have done, because that's what I do. That's how I work.
There's so much more depth to that when you hear it like that, because that was one of the things initially I was like, wow, that sounds like that's a bold statement to say, but when you put it in that perspective, what's your response to that, Sarah? Somebody who's been through the education system, both working with it now, but also as a neurodivergent person growing up through the education system, how does that ring with you?
I think my initial response is there's so much more depth than that was communicated on the programme, for sure.
That's fair.
And definitely, I'm very much someone, kind of, when I'm working with young people, kind of looking at a situation and seeing how it can be improved, is looking at the whole picture. Like, if you're just focusing what's going on in school, actually there could be wider things. And, stuff from home can come into school and vice versa. And that was certainly the case when I was growing up. As I know that many of us autistic people, we actually masked during school kind of how we felt, our true emotions. So we weren't, flying up on the radar, because we didn't feel safe. But when we felt safe at home, that's when we'd show kind of our distress and our true emotional state. So I think it's really interesting to kind of have Marie's perspective that perhaps wasn't communicated on the show.
Yeah, and because masking is such a huge thing, it's one of my bugbears is the lack of understanding of masking in the education system. Because for parents, again, something that was really nice to hear was that you have that no blame strategy as well that goes along, because parent blame is something that companies masking so strongly.
Oh,
and one of the questions I had was that, do you find, and I'm guessing what your answer is going to be now, having heard what you've had to say about that introduction, but there's that sort of concern that does containing these behaviours in that fashion basically force masking at school. I was interested to see that you work with the parents as well, but is that a concern that you carry? Is that something that you address?
Yeah, 100%. So again, what wasn't shown, because wasn't enough time, is all the training that we did with the entire school staff, the training that we did with the parents and carers, because we always say, or I always say, you cannot just have a bunch of strategies and just put them in place with a child. It doesn't make any sense, because it might work for a period of time or it just might not work at all. And what I'm all about is sustainability, and actually, how do we meet a need? We cannot take away a need from a young person, but what we have to understand is what the need is and how we can meet that need. And there's a huge misunderstanding in schools, and I'm going to keep saying it, no blame, no shame. I am not going to blame or shame any adults for their perceptions, because I genuinely believe we have our perceptions from our belief systems and all these kind of things. And it's discussions like this that we have to have that help change our perceptions. However, there is a huge amount of school staff who don't necessarily understand that we cannot fit a child into the school model. We need to adapt and have this understanding in order for the child to succeed at school. Now, some young people do need a specialist provision. I worked in one for 10 years. Absolutely, they do. But there's other young people, and I had so many young people who came to the pupil referral unit who actually probably shouldn't have been there and who could have remained at mainstream school if the school had created a contained environment as a base that young people, like Sarah's just said, that young people could have felt safe enough in, so that then the adults were then able to understand what those needs are and then meet those needs. So I totally agree with you. Masking is a huge issue, but I think part of the issue is the adults around the young people not understanding that their needs are their needs. You can't take the need away and replace it with, it just doesn't work that way. And I think that's where the misunderstanding comes from.
I think that's really interesting to hear it from that perspective, because I think looking back and the conversations I've had with other neurodivergent adults was there just didn't seem to be that understanding. And it was very much, I think it was very much one size fits all on a very systemic level within schools. And I think as long as that kind of dominant, there's always going to be kids that slip through the net.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is I've had lots of foster children come through my family. My mum, she's not anymore, but she used to be a foster carer. And but I was a young adult when she started fostering. So I had quite a big role in supporting these young people. And a couple of I call them my foster brothers or foster siblings, because mum had 2 boys long term, so for 7-8 years. So, and they're our family, basically. Yeah. And one of them is severely autistic, and he is, or was, he's a young adult now, able to manage in mainstream school. He didn't need a specialist provision, and that was okay, that's his needs. But what was so interesting is when he started in secondary school, he's in year 7, my mum and dad had separated by them, so my mum was doing it single-handedly, and my mum didn't have all this knowledge, so she was doing these things that I talk about, but she wouldn't have been able to explain to you the way I am what she was doing. And it was so interesting to watch her, because when he first started secondary school, they did not understand his needs at all, and he had the most horrific time when he started. And she went into school and she told me clearly, she sat around this big table, there's about 12 professionals sat around the table who said, we've been here for years and years, etc. And, if this doesn't change, if he doesn't change, he'll be excluded within the first term. And my mum, she's quite small, she sat there and she said, no, he will not be excluded. She said, if I can manage him at home, then you all can manage him at school. And I always tell that story because for him, he should have been there. And after that, things happened and the school were really, really good. He's now in his early 20s. He got his GCSEs. He's doing really well. But I always think to myself, if my mum hadn't done that, I don't know where he would be now. And the school, no blame, no shame, they just didn't understand. They wanted him to fit in the box. And that he can't fit in a box, and he shouldn't.
Well, that's so interesting. I mean, hearing that side of it, and I'm sure Sarah will be able to sort of back me up on this. One of the real concerns that I had from the show was that very clearly, at least a couple of these kids had extra needs in that sense. So they were autistic, or they had, as you said, that the behaviours are a reflection of an unmet need, and that need wasn't being met, and those needs are stemming from special educational needs. And it really wasn't addressed in the show. And is there a reason that wasn't addressed?
Yes. So just to be clear, it was addressed as in throughout the time that, well, still with the families now, I talk to them all the time, but throughout the time I was with the families, it was, but you're right, it wasn't shown on the screen. Part of that reason was being respectful to the parents and their wants and needs. And it was very difficult because, and I've got to be very careful what I say. I don't want to say anything that then the parents would be, not happy that I say, but we also have to take into consideration that the parents some of the parents had other children. So the children who were featured had siblings. I've got to be careful what I say, but the siblings, they also had needs as well, etc. And the parents didn't want that to be shown or talked about in certain ways because they were trying to consider their whole family unit. And I really get that. I'm really respectful of that. But I also understand it's really important that I say, even though I'm explaining that now, I genuinely understand as a viewer that of course you're going to make a judgment upon what you see. I watch telly so differently now. I've always I do. I used to watch TV and then you take face value what you see. Of course you do, because that's what you expect as a viewer. And whilst everything was done as honestly, well, it was done honestly as it could be done. It really was, in my opinion. In regards to that side of things, we had to just respect the parents' wishes. So, but I do understand, I really do.
Well, it's interesting because I had one of the parents, I won't say whose parent it was or which child, but one of the parents reached out to me and say, we are actually aware of their extra needs, and that is actually being dealt with as part of this. I didn't want it in the show, actually, because I was concerned about bullying being a factor. I thought that was a really interesting perspective on it, and it kind of backs up what you're saying there. It's not as simple as, we're just going with the cameras and we can film everything. You've got so many more people to consider.
Yeah, I think what's really important, if a child does have kind of any needs or any diagnoses or whatever, it's absolutely the child's right for who they want to know about that or not. So, and again, you've got to think about, will they grow up and will they be annoyed that the whole world knows that they've got these conditions or not? So I think from that perspective, it was the right call not to label it, because I think if I was growing up as a teen and that was on national TV, that would be something I'd be very self-conscious, very angry about, probably thinking about what I was like 10 years ago. Yeah. So I think I guess from that perspective, and being somebody who perhaps has similar needs, I think that was the right call.
That's really cool.
I think that's interesting that you say that, Sarah, because I've had so many young adults, which I wasn't expecting actually, contact me, and very similar to your story, Sarah, actually, so that's why it's really compelling to listen to, have said, I had an awful time at school, but I didn't want to be labelled, which is understandable, that's fine. And there's some who have said, I wish that I could have spoken about it, or someone could have spoken about it. But one thing I do feel that I should say, still being respectful to, of course, the young people and their families' wishes, I do feel that if I had my time again, you asked me this question not too long ago, Duncan, I do think that what I should have said in a sentence was, to camera, was just a sentence or a short paragraph around understanding that unmet needs can be SEND needs, they can be these needs, they can be those needs, and just go kind of giving an overview of what those underlying needs could be, because they're not always SEND needs. There is other needs as well. And I feel that in reflection, I should have done that. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for your honesty. That's really, I've got to say, it's encouraging.
Yeah, I do.
Well, I really respect that. I've always respected anyone who can go back and go, you know what, I that's something I could have done differently. Yeah. I do that with most of my life. Sarah, I want to focus on you for a second, because as a neurodivergent person, as an autistic person, how would you have felt in the situation having the cameras come in and show you that way? You just sort of touched on it there. How would that have reflected for you? Would that have been a helpful thing in that way, or?
I think, I mean, I can only speak for myself here, but personally, I would have hated it. I wouldn't want to have been on camera at all. I think I was very self-conscious of my differences, even though I didn't know what they were then. I was certainly aware they were there, and I was very sensitive to any time they were brought up in front of other people. I very much wanted to keep it private to myself. Again, this could be different for other people, but on a personal level, and I think, you know, if I was in primary school and they filmed how I was in primary school, I could just imagine my teen self being like very kind of angry about it and perhaps some resentment. And I think it would be something probably only in the last few recent years I'd be able to put to peace. If I'm just thinking about, you know, how I was, you know, during my adolescence and early adulthood. So yeah, I think it's different for every individual, but personally, I think there would have been a lot of difficulties for me having kind of cameras in that situation if I was in primary school. But again, the people in the show may feel differently as they grow up.
So I've got to say, I mean, at the end, the kids, all three of the kids that were focused on seemed really to have progressed in themselves. I'd take that beyond not just that they were displaying less challenging behaviours. Certainly for the two lads, you could really see a peace inside them that was coming out. And I was really, I mean, one of the kids was sort of shown at home and the relationship that he had there. And you could see the joy in his face when he was getting things right. And I thought that was a really beautiful element that was in there that kind of got missed in a way. I'm really glad that was in there. How do you, I mean, you're saying you're still in touch with all these families. How are the kids getting on?
Brilliant. They're really getting on really, really well. But I think it's also important to say, considering the kind of the focus of this podcast, it's really important to say they're getting on really well, not just because of the work I've done. I never labelled myself as a behaviour expert. Other people have, but it's okay. But what I do say is no one person, one professional body can do it all for the children and young people. I really think that's important to say. And actually, the reason why they're doing so well is because of the work that I did in the school, the work that the school then continues to do to this day, the work that the families are doing, but also the work that the external professionals are also doing with those young people. So again, you know, and no one would know that after the show, but I think it's important to say that's why they're doing really well. And it's not just about, okay, they're no longer at risk of exclusion at school. It's more than that. They're happy. These young people, you know, all of their families and their parents, etc., who I think were really lovely people. But and again, no blame or shame to the parents at all. But the young people, of course, they were happy in moments, but actually in other moments they just weren't happy. Their life, it didn't feel right to them. They weren't coping with navigating it. They weren't coping at school. So to me, great that they're no longer at risk of exclusion. But what's even more important is that they're happy. And to me, that's when I talk about containment strategies and supporting young people to feel emotionally safe and contained. That's what everybody has a right to. Like every child has a right to be happy. They do, you know.
That is so kind of, it's actually refreshing to hear, because you don't hear it much about education. And you know, I certainly never felt safe or happy in education. So to kind of hear that's a focus of yours, that's something I think is really like vital.
And I think listening to you, so I feel a bit emotional, but someone said to me, a very wise person once said to me, if I ever don't feel that way, then it's time for me to change my job. So I don't mind feeling emotional. But the reason why I feel emotional is because I've heard so many young people say what you're saying, Sarah, but as now a young adult, to hear you say that and reflect back on that is quite emotional, because no one should feel like that. It's just not okay.
It's one of those things, and it's what I was reading an interview actually with Idris Elba, because they were talking about, you know, is it going to be a black Bond and all this kind of stuff. And he said the problem with the question, the fact that this is a question shows that there's still a problem. And I think that really relates to the neurodiversity side of things and ableism, is the fact that it's still a conversation shows that it hasn't been addressed properly yet within the world. The fact that there is a neuro divide, if you like, is an issue in itself, and there shouldn't be. Our goal should be a society that we don't see in ranges of colour or diversity or sexuality or anything like that. We just see human beings, people who are going about their lives and deserve happiness and acceptance.
Yeah.
And it's so refreshing to hear that sort of perspective coming in. I'm really glad we've had this opportunity, because it really is. I'm really glad. Because there was a very easy way to sort of go, oh, all this was done, and kind of go off. But it's so nice hearing that you're already considering all this stuff and the stuff that's going on. I do want to address one thing that happened in the show, and it was one of the most difficult moments for me. And I'll preface that with an explanation. I have to restrain my daughter quite regularly. My daughter's very violent and aggressive when she's in meltdown as part of PDA, and I've got other people I have to consider. My son's only 6. My wife is quite ill, and if she's going to be throwing things and people at risk, I have to be able to contain her and restrain her in that way. I've been trained in self-restraint. And there was the scene where you had to restrain one of the kids, and I'd like to hear what your perspective is on that first, when that happened.
Yeah, no problem. So when it happened, so again, prior to that, so I'll explain it all. So prior to that, it wasn't captured on the cameras, simply because cameras weren't rigged in the classroom. It was literally someone with a camera. So whenever something was happening, they went to where it was. So something had happened which was really dangerous in the classroom, and he had come outside of the classroom. He tried to get back in, but he ended up being in the playground. Now, lots of people, understandably so, were saying, he's in the big open play. Sure, he's safe in the playground. Again, a couple of things. First thing is what you couldn't see. There's 2 entrances off to the playground, which, again, you cannot judge in that moment what a child has done previously when you're making a decision whether to physically contain them or not. So just to stress that. So I wasn't thinking, oh, previously he's ran off and done this so that he might do that. That wasn't the case, but just to explain that scenario. But what had happened is, in the playground, there was another boy. Again, I'm not going to say too much about that boy out of respect for him and his family, but he had thrown a ball at that young boy. Then he had kind of moved backwards and almost tripped over the bucket that was on the floor. So putting everything together in that moment, and I could see he was ready to flight. So putting everything together in that moment, I made the decision to contain him in that moment. So when I made that decision, obviously we're in the middle of the playground, so there was no chairs about. So usually if I'm by myself, there would be a chair, and then you'd place the young person on the chair, and all as you've been trained to do, etc. So that's what I would have done, but that wasn't available in the playground. So I held him in the safest way that I could by myself, and then immediately asked for someone to go and call for assistance. But understandably so, lots of people are saying, oh, but we don't use that restraint anymore, etc., etc. Yep, absolutely correct what everybody's saying. However, a skilled practitioner is able to still use that technique if it's just for a moment, if it's not all the time in a scenario like that. So like I said, if I was in the, elsewhere and there was a chair there or whatever, I wouldn't have. But a skilled practitioner like myself, because I've done countless physical containments over the years, so I was able to judge in that scenario. However, like I've said before, I completely understand that to millions of people watching, they won't know all of that. So they won't think to themselves, oh, Marie, she's a skilled practitioner, so I completely understand that. So I'm not going to argue that case. And I'm going to say that I wouldn't promote that someone was to use the technique that I used. It was just in that moment in order to keep him safe. And the last thing was just to put it into full perspective as well. Again, we did hundreds and hundreds of hours in the school, was therefore probably on and off because lockdowns and bubbles and things, but just under a year, and 1 restraint was done with him. And it's also important to say that after that containment, because of all of the other work that was done, if it was just that containment, it would have been different, a bit like I was saying the balance before. After that, our attachment with myself and the young person got stronger, because that was the first time for him that he had ever been in a scenario where he felt out of control, that someone else was able to take control of the situation for him and help him feel, oh, someone can manage me in this scenario. So I think it's also important to say that. Yeah.
What's your response to that, Sarah?
I mean, I know what kind of part of the program that was, and as a viewer, I found it very hard to watch.
Yeah, I get that.
And just to see that the stress in the moment, but at the same time, I felt I couldn't make 100% clear judgment on it, because how it edited, it was quickly here, there, everywhere, so I couldn't see everything that was going on. So I felt, rather than judging the situation, I think I was left with more questions of how it got to that. So thank you kind of for explaining your perspective there, because obviously, you know, like you said, it's a TV show, they're going to edit it in certain ways and everything like that. But I think kind of watching it, what was going through my mind is, I guess, how is this affecting Oscar? Obviously very distressed in the moment, but also perhaps in the longer term, what would the impact of what happened will be? So I think that's kind of where my thoughts were when I was watching it on TV.
And I'm not going to argue or dispute or say, I think that's so fair, because again, as a viewer, of course, you know, I completely understand. So I can't say anything, but I really understand that. The only thing I can say in response, because it was kind of like a statement stroke question at the end of what you've just said, is that in those scenarios, it's always well thought out, even if it's very quick in the moment, only because of my experience. So because of my experience, I'm able to think quickly in the moment. But I do understand that not everybody can. So that's why I said I really want to say that I wouldn't promote just go to a restraint or whatever for any other adults if you're not in that scenario. So for you, Duncan, like you said, you know your daughter, you know about, you know, you can assess the situation really quickly. But I am very conscious that not everybody can, not because they can't, but just they don't have the experience or whatever it may be. So again, I just want to say that I really, really get that. I'm not arguing or disputing that. I really get it.
I think the other side of it too is, for me, as a father, the last thing I ever imagined myself having to do is be in a situation where I had to physically restrain my daughter. It's a horrible thing. And it's something I mentally struggle with afterwards. The mental process I go through afterwards, I have to really decompress. And because to me, it's just the last thing I ever wanted to have to do to my daughter. It causes me, I'm not going to do the whole it hurts me more than you thing, but the distress it causes me is, I would say, equal to what my daughter goes through, having been in that situation. But you have to make a call based on everybody's safety. So I think getting the setting of what that was and what happened leading up to it, and again, what the cameras don't pick up, the periphery of what's going on. I think, it's very cool to hear that. These strategies that you use and the system that you're using with these 7 points of containment. Now, you're working with the government on a new project, is that right?
Yeah, so I've last September, I think it was, it's called the Behaviour Hubs. So the hubs, they work with schools across the country, and they work with different schools and support around behaviour, and then support one school that has an outstanding Ofsted grading, but it's looked into it's not just, we're just outstanding, it's what are you doing around behaviour, and where's your evidence that what you're doing around behaviour is really working for these young people. Then those schools then support other schools who are maybe requires improvement from Ofsted or inadequate from Ofsted, and working around behaviour with those schools. So really trying to join up the thinking with schools so we can just start talking about behaviour as a communication of an unmet need. We can start talking about, for those young people who are able to cope in a mainstream setting, what can we do to support them? What real practical things can we do to support these young people? So that's why I wanted to be part of this. And I thought it's quite interesting, because people who know me will say, oh, it's interesting that you're part of this. But I think it's important. I think that we've got too many divides. It's kind of that, this is one community to here, this is one group here, and this is one group here. And sure, that's okay, that's fine. But actually, it's about connecting and joining the dots. It's the only way, I believe, other people might disagree, but it's the only way I believe that we can do the best for these young people. We've got to join up and take the best bits from each other. And the bits that aren't best, that's okay. We can talk to each other about that and work out how to improve. But I just don't think we should all be working as separate entities. I feel really strongly about that on a personal and professional level.
What's your response to that, Sarah?
I think this can be, I will admit, hard at times, only because I see people sharing their views and everything, and they stand by strong, and in some cases I strongly disagree. And I think it's cases of practices like ABA, and I know in America they use also electric shocks in one school, which is absolutely horrific. I know, it's just awful, and you just hear about this far too often. And I think sometimes you know, there are hard lines where if that's the place these people are going to, I'm not sure if I can even have that conversation with them for very kind of personal reasons.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, there is a divide. And I mean, in the autistic community, it's so strong. So there's the autism community and the autistic community, which are two different things.
Yeah.
The autism community generally is mainly autism parents, professionals, perhaps some autistic people there, but often they feel ostracized. Then you have the autistic community, which is just autistic people. And there is a divide. And sometimes you do see it on social media. And it's one of those things where I think the more I've kind of seen this go on, the more I think a lot of it is information. I think it is a bit culture wars as well, which doesn't really help. And quite often, I think there is a whole industry based on your child's got this awful diagnosis, you need all these interventions, you need this, you need that, blah, 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 blah. And autistic people saying, actually, this isn't helpful, this could be harmful. But the parents are told by some professionals, this is essential, this is the only way your child's going to thrive, essentially. And there's just this massive divide. I think it would be better, or if it would be easier if we could come together. And again, I'm always very open, you know, if parents reach out to me or they want to talk things, I'm always happy to do that. I mean, I do have a hard line, and it is quite a high threshold in terms of, you know, people I feel like I can't have this conversation. But I think there are kind of real issues there that I think needs to work through. And I mean, if we want the best for our young people, I think we do need to have these conversations. So there is more of a kind of a dialogue rather than Twitter spats between some people and families and carers. But
I think what you've brought up there is just so important, and it's that dialogue that's got to be there. And as somebody who's, you know, I'm part of the autism community, if you like, I'm adjacent is my position. And my family, except, you know, half of my family in my home are neurodivergent. And so from that perspective, I have that. But my value, and I've done this from the start, is always to be seeking the advice of actually autistic people, because if I'm going to understand my daughter, who better to give me that understanding than somebody who can articulate what she's experiencing as now being there. So I bring that in all the time. But something you brought up there that I thought was really, I did want to ask about was ABA, because I have a real problem with ABA, and that's from listening to autistic people and having read up a lot on post-ABA. So there's one, the socially anxious advocate, I think she's called, but she was an ABA therapist who left after she'd sort of gone back and started talking to her patients later in life, and finding all this sort of PTSD and the repression of the, you know, things like repressing stimming, which I hardline refuse to accept that should be done unless it's self-injurious or potentially dangerous to somebody else. But this whole thing of trying to mold neurodivergent people into a neurotypical world is a real big issue for me, and I rally against it, and I think it serves to contribute to this whole divide that you're talking about there, Sarah. What are your thoughts on that, Maria, in the sense of how do we let our kids be our kids and be themselves and respect who they are as neurodivergent people, whilst also bringing in the line of safety of others being and themselves being part of that? How do we avoid going down this track of ABA repressing?
I think, I think it's about, like I said earlier, but it's about we've got to start off with ourselves, because the children and young people, we're the one who give them the avenues for a voice, but ultimately we are their voice for a long time. So I think it starts off with the perceptions again. I think it starts off with, so Sarah was talking about understandably so it might be quite difficult to engage in conversations with certain groups, etc. I think the first thing we need to do is kind of work out where everyone has a right to a voice. So I'm not going to try and squash anyone from saying whatever they want to say. That's fine. But I think the first thing is understanding where they're coming from and why they're saying what they're saying. So I'm with you, Duncan. I'm with both of you, actually. I've got the same views, but this is my perspective. I think that's where we start off from. And I can do this because of all the personal development work that I've personally done as well. I probably wouldn't be able to say this many years ago. And So I think we start off there, and then we understand that because of the different perceptions, we're going to voice those beliefs or voice what we believe that should or shouldn't happen in certain ways. However, to decide whether we should engage in that conversation or we shouldn't engage in that conversation is dependent upon how that's then expressed. So does someone genuinely want to have a two-way discussion? Or actually, does someone just want to beat someone else down? Or is this just an opportunity to, is it unhealthy? Is it going to go anywhere? Because if it isn't, then that's where I won't engage. But I will always engage with people who have different points of view, etc., because there's a reason that they think the way they think. So I agree with both of you. I don't agree with that either. But actually, we have to understand why they believe that first in order to support them to potentially change their perceptions. Otherwise, we just sit there going back and forth and actually never getting anywhere. So I agree with you. I don't think we should try and squeeze people into a certain model. But the reason why some people are trying to squeeze them into a certain model could be, I'm not saying this is, but it could be because actually it makes them feel really uncomfortable. It could be because they don't have the skills and knowledge about how else to do it. It could be that they just don't have the experiences. There's so many different reasons. That's why I'm so open to conversation, because it's not on the same line. It's just to illustrate my point. My mum's got dementia, and before when I have conversations with people around dementia, there's so many people who someone else could describe it as ignorant in regards to not understanding what dementia really is and how it actually affects a person and their behaviour, because my mum has different needs now. But I'm not going to say to that person, oh my gosh, I can't believe you don't know anything, and start berating them. What I'm going to do is try and understand where they've come from and why. And if it's beneficial, I'll speak to them and support them to potentially change their perceptions. I'm not going to force anything, but I think we cannot fit everybody into the box that we want because it makes us feel better. We have to make sure we're meeting their needs, and full stop. We need to meet their needs. So no, I don't agree with squeezing everybody into a particular box. It's absolute, to me, it's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, if you try and squeeze everyone into one box, you're going to end up with a disaster, and you're just going to destroy people's lives, like, period. But I think you just see that all so often with people who perhaps haven't thought about or aren't aware of the consequences of that. So, or, they may kind of think, well, this worked for me, so it's got to work for this person as well. But, humans aren't like that, So, not at all.
I think that's just it. And it's that thing of, it stems back to, I guess, what we started this whole thing with, is meeting people where they're at and what their needs are. And not trying to, like you say, force into a mold that isn't them. But it's that thing of, I really appreciated hearing that sense that, no, I need to listen to their perspective first, because it's got to be cemented. There's a reason they believe what they believe, and it's got to be cemented in something. And then moving beyond that and hopefully educating. And I think it's one of those things that I see it a lot on my group on Facebook, where people may say, my example is usually that they might say, my child has been diagnosed with autism. And the majority of the autistic community hate that, because it's not identity first. It's part of who they are. So they prefer to be labelled as being autistic. Trouble is, doctors, professionals all say they have autism. And so they carry this language forward. And it's being able to sort of go in gently and say, just so you know, this is actually how actually autistic people generally tend to prefer to be referred as, because it is an identity. Like someone sent me a meme that was fantastic, that was, I have gay, I have Norwegian. It's like, no.
Oh, I've seen that one. Was that Laura McConnell?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, that's how I saw it from her, and it's brilliant. And I think it's a really good way of explaining it. Because I wasn't even aware of it really till I kind of discovered I was autistic, and I had the preference for identity first. And I think that just brings the expected, it's a part of us, so that's why we have the identity first, rather than something we live with. It's there all the time, 24/7 for the whole of our lives. So I really like that meme. It's a really good way.
I loved it. It explains. So it's nice. I can put it up every now and again, just so people understand, you know, this is why they don't, you know, this is why actually autistic people don't like this, is because it's actually who they are. But it's that thing of being able to, you know, go in and there's an expectation sometimes that I think people should know everything the minute they walk through the door. So the second my daughter had an autism, we knew that my daughter was likely autistic and that there was going to be a diagnosis coming at some point. That's when I started my learning about what autism is, how it affects people, who autistic people are, actually meeting up with autistic people and becoming friends with them, and all the stuff that's come on from that. But I didn't know anything going in, and we don't have all the answers presented to us the second we either are going for or have a diagnosis of anything. It's a learning curve, and most people don't want to offend anybody. It's just that the way they've been, you know, either taught or the words they've been sort of shown to use.
I feel like I see this daily, all the time, you know, people kind of getting, I think, feeling quite strongly like you got to say it this way, that way, blah, 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 blah. And I had people say that when I joined the autistic community, when I was a new member, because I didn't know, like I was still figuring it out for myself. So yeah, I think there are some things that happen that are awful that generally need to be addressed. But I find personally, if it's things such as language, or like, you know, if someone says person with autism, I have my preferences, but I'm not gonna cling on to that. I think in the grand scheme of things, you know, it's something they'll learn and people will figure out anyway. But yeah, I think sometimes you see that people fussing over that, but then you see projects like Spectrum 10K, which could be potentially very harmful, and you know, the electric shocks. I'm like, those are the kind of, to me, that's where the real kind of anger should be addressed, rather than, I guess, little technical points over language. But that's a personal view. Yeah.
I think the final thing I would say is that, you know, I've even sat here, I've got my own experiences, but both of you have got your own experiences from in different ways as well. And so I've sat and I've learned loads, and I was really looking forward to coming on, because I think what my final thing I would say is that we've got to have more of these conversations, in my opinion. Because you're always learning something new. You know, Duncan, I'm hoping I'm not speaking out of turn when I say I'm sure you feel that you're learning things every day still with your daughter. You don't think you feel like you know it all at this in this moment, you know. And I think that's, the more I
know I don't know.
And I just kind of think that's where we all are, and I just feel that that's okay. But we have to keep having conversations, and healthy conversations that move us forward, and don't just keep us standing in the spot spinning around and around, but things that move us forward. Because the final thing I would say is I've had thousands of messages since the show, which has been amazing, but the one that stuck out the most for me, and of course I won't say their name, is a young neurodiverse adult, and he said to me, all I want is for everybody to come together so that we are modeling the communications for the next generation. And he said, the way that some of it is now being communicated, it's fine to talk about things that, you know, could be changed or you can do different, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But he said, just remember, as you're communicating that, you're modeling it to the next generation about how to communicate. And that just stuck with me. And I definitely, of course, I won't say his name, but that really stuck with me. And I thought to myself, I'm really going to take that on board. So that's the final thing I wanted to say.
That's wisdom in essence, isn't it? That's fantastic. I totally agree with that. And I think that's the important thing. The reason I got involved with all this in the start is because I want my daughter to live in a world where she's not misunderstood, but rather celebrated for the amazing things that she does. And there are so many, and the blessing I've had of becoming part of this community is meeting so many people of all kind of different neurodivergent backgrounds, all kinds of different backgrounds, period. And the amazing things that they do that are just different because I can't think the way they do. And I have to talk to my friend Emily, who does these amazing art things. She makes jewelry, but she sees these microcosms in everything and puts that into a jewelry, and it's stuff that I just wouldn't see. because my brain doesn't work that way. And yeah, the more we can celebrate, I think, the differences. Obviously, we've got to work together as a community and a society, and we've got to look after people, make sure people aren't at, risk of harm. But beyond that, this is part of being in a diverse world, and it's a fantastic thing. It shouldn't be this complex thing that it is now, because as I say, the problem is we're having the conversation. It shouldn't be needed.
Yeah.
I want to thank you guys so much. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Glad to be here.
And Marie, thank you so much for taking the time and for setting the record straight. And I know that I feel a lot more confident with my opinions now and what I understood from seeing the show. So I really thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
And I thank you too. And really nice to meet you as well, Sarah. Thank you.
No problem.
So there you have it. That was the interview. And I've got to say, for myself, I came out surprised in a really good way. I was expecting us to get to the end of that interview and kind of, well, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree would be the the quote at the end of it, sort of thing. But I thought Maureen handled herself remarkably well. And I hope that the things that she's saying really do stick and will stick with the stuff that she's doing with the government and also with her business. And I wish her the best of luck with that. Thanks for joining us. As I said before, please do hit like, hit subscribe, ring the bell so that you know when we've got new content coming up. I will see you on the next episode. In the meantime, stay safe.